On This Week in Enterprise Tech, you can thank your Fourth Amendment rights on a drug dealer. Do we need to abandon the cloud and the future of enterprise storage? With Howard Marks. Twyett on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twyett. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 112, recorded October 20th, 2014. Deep Storage with Howard Marks. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by PagerDuty. PagerDuty decreases alerting noise for IT operations and developers to ensure that the right engineers are notified at the right time. Increase your uptime and sign up for a 14-day free trial at pagerduty.com/twit. And by TEKSERVE, the world's largest independent Apple retailer and professional services provider. Go to TEKSERVE.com/Twyett-7sins to get access to the free ebook on the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment. Welcome to Twyett, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. But of course, I'm not alone. I'm joined by some of my fellow geeks in arms, starting with Mr. Brian Chee, the director of the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii, who seems to be having a Mr. Peabody on his shoulder at the moment. Is this your current obsession, Cheebert?
Well, I've always liked, stuffed animals with character. And, Mr. Peabody and his pet boy Sherman has lots of character. The movie could have been better, but boy, was it a blast from the past for my childhood.
Absolutely. We love that. Now, also, are you safe right now? I know you've got a tropical storm. I think it was just degraded or downgraded over your head at the moment. Do we have to worry about you getting blown away during the episode?
Actually, it's quite a bit north of Kauai now. So that's good. It did not do that little hockey stick turn like our other hurricanes. This was only a Category 1, which is big deal. Iniki was a Category 4, which is a very, very serious storm. All so, no, it is just soggy here. My backyard is a lake.
Soggy, but not broken. Over to the other coast, hopefully not having to deal with any sorts of storms whatsoever, is my good friend, Mr. Curtis Franklin from Information Week Radio. Curtis, how are you these days?
Padre, I'm doing reasonably well. I'm back in the office after what has turned out to be about 3 weeks of travel. It's nice to be here. We've got a cool, crisp autumn day here in Florida, only up in the lower 80s. So, living life down in the peninsula and enjoying it.
Well, gentlemen, we've got quite a bit of material to cover today. What do you say we get straight into the blips? The first one comes to us from the BBC, and the BBC, the right to be forgotten. Now, the BBC is fighting back the soon-to-be-enforced right to be forgotten by indexing for remembrance everything that is forgotten. The EU ruling forced Google to set up a form on its website that allows people to request links be delisted if they were, quote-unquote, inadequate, irrelevant, or no longer relevant to the particular search term, such as a person's name. Now, people requesting a removal must, 1, provide the link to the material, 2, name their home country, 3, explain why the link should be removed, and 4, provide photo ID. The BBC, for its part, will be regularly updating a list of links to articles that have been removed from searches for those search terms. They made it clear that they are not republishing or promoting the links, merely creating an index that shows how many links have been delisted for those interested in debate.
Well, my blip comes from my rant about why hasn't the United States gone to chip and pin, something more secure than the swipe and sign that is currently in place. Well, our President Obama decided to get involved and is saying, in an effort to speed up adoption of chip and pin credit cards in the United States, President Obama has signed an executive order forcing the U.S. government to change government credit cards, Social Security, and veteran benefits to chip and pin, aka EMV, which stands for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. It is hoped that this move will encourage the private sector to upgrade the back-end systems required to process chip and pin transactions.
Now, IBM, Big Blue, is getting a little smaller, and it's paying for the privilege. IBM wants out of the chip business in the worst way, which is, when you think about it, how it was in the chip business. In an announcement earlier today, IBM announced that they're transferring their chip manufacturing operations to global foundries. Notice that I didn't say they were selling the operations. That because IBM actually gave global foundries a check for $1.5 billion along with the keys to the building. IBM said to investors that the chip business had been underperforming for quite a while because of its smaller scale. Shedding the unit should allow Big Blue to devote more funds to larger and more profitable businesses like, providing enterprise apps for iPads.
Speaking of iPads, Apple Pay is among us. If you've got an updated Apple device and you can find a compatible terminal, well, maybe you can be one of the first to try the new Apple Pay. Apple officially launched their new payment service today, giving owners of NFC-enabled iPhones the capability to pay with Touch ID. 35 retail brands, including Macy's, McDonald's, Texaco, and Whole Foods, have agreed to roll out Apple Pay-enabled points of presence before the end of the year. Though this isn't the first attempt at NFC payments, Best Buy installed NFC scanners back in 2011, but canceled the program when it proved to be too expensive to maintain, Apple may be walking into a perfect storm of NFC critical mass and a desire for increased security for financial transactions.
Well, my next story blip comes from Engadget. And now unlimited cheap power brought to you by the Lockheed Skunk Works. The famous Lockheed Skunk Works is trying to tell the world that it has developed a compact fusion reactor that will be ready for consumption within a couple of decades. To say that this will change the world is an understatement in the way I figure it. This development will either go a long way to creating world peace or create a smoking hole in the globe around the area of the Middle East. Only time will tell how ubiquitous and cheap power will change the world's balance of power. The next year to watch is 2020, when Lockheed says they will have a working prototype.
Now, speaking of working, customers say they're ready to hold a grudge. According to a survey conducted by Princeton Survey Research Associates on behalf of creditcards.com, nearly half of all consumers say that they're going to take recent security breaches into account when choosing vendors for their holiday shopping. And those breaches mean that retailers with bad security could also have bad holiday sales. It's been really hard to put real numbers on security breaches, but vengeful consumers could mean that much more than corporate pride is on the line behind these very, very porous firewalls.
And finally, could the future of telco smashing broadband be Google Fiber, but without the fiber? Google has filed documents with the FCC that seem to indicate that they are ready to test a super fast wireless technology in San Mateo and Mountain View, California. Though the idea of municipal wireless isn't new, the technologies that Google is combining to make it possible is. According to the FCC application, Google will be using radios in the 5.8, 24.2, and 71.76 gigahertz range. Combined with beam-shaping antennas, this gives Google a way to push wireless connectivity long, medium, and short distances while maintaining throughput and avoiding the uber-congested 2.4 gigahertz range. Well, that's it for the blips. When we come back, we're getting into the bites. But first, let's take a moment to thank the first sponsor of the Twilight Riot. Now, the tech that we use in the enterprise gets better and better with every generation. Servers fail over, switches route around outages, and storage has redundancies for redundancies of redundancies. But no matter how sophisticated our tools get, there will always be the need for remote hands. The fact is that nothing compares to having a trained engineer on site who can fix problems, and that's why we need a way to alert them when problems arise. So I welcome to the Twilight Riot, PagerDuty. Now, PagerDuty is an operations platform that delivers visibility and actionable intelligence to help increase the uptime of your apps, servers, websites, and databases. As the hub of your operations, PagerDuty connects all of your systems into a single view. There you can see over 100 ready-to-use integrations, including Nagios, New Relic, Keynote, App Dynamics, or you can roll your own with PagerDuty's APIs. That means you can customize PagerDuty to fit how you and your team work, regardless of the location or size. Now, this gives you the coveted single pane of glass that lets you see how your network is working at a glance and automate your troubleshooting process to decrease response time. When an incident occurs, PagerDuty notifies the right team and member based on on-call schedules, and personalized alerting preferences. The incident first filters through automatic filtering and deduplication to ensure that only actionable alerts get pushed through the system, because there's nothing worse than someone on duty being called over and over for false alarms. Now, if the dispatches alerts by automated phone calls, you can also choose SMS, email, and push notifications as backups. And if alerts are missed, PagerDuty will automatically escalate issues to another team member until it's responded to. And PagerDuty is fully distributed across multiple data centers and multiple hosting providers with multiple contact methods, so you'll never miss an alert. But it's not just about displays and alerts. PagerDuty's analytic tools will identify common problems based on what it sees in your network, allowing you to proactively make system improvements and prevent future outages. Now, PagerDuty is trusted by thousands of companies, including Microsoft, GitHub, Boeing, Nike, Pinterest, and Box. Why not you? Here's what we want you to do. We want you to get the right engineer on the right problem at the right time, and do it with PagerDuty. Visit pagerduty.com/twit to sign up for a free 14-day trial, and for as little as $19 a month, you could increase your uptime with PagerDuty. When you sign up, you'll also be entered for a chance to win a PagerDuty exclusive on-call survival kit. That's pagerduty.com/twit. pagerduty.com/twit. And we thank PagerDuty for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Let's get straight into the bites. This one has legs. It's now official. Law enforcement needs a warrant for wireless taps. Now, last Thursday, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that your location metadata as obtained through cell phone towers is protected from unreasonable search and seizure by the Fourth Amendment. This has all sorts of applications within the enterprise and within how we do business on the internet. Now, the ruling stemmed from the conviction of Mr. Sean Alvin Tracy. The police allege that Mr. Tracy came to Broward County to buy cocaine. They obtained a warrant to search his phone for phone numbers of calls he had made or that he had received, but the warrant did not explicitly say that they had permission to obtain metadata about the phone's location from cell phone providers. Now, that location data led to surveillance, which resulted in the arrest of Mr. Tracy with a kilogram of cocaine and $23,000 in cash. He's unsuccessfully tried to suppress his location data in the original case, but the motion was denied. But then the 4th District Court upheld the conviction, and the Supreme Court overturned it based on the illegality of location metadata. The takeaway is this: a warrant for a device does not automatically grant law enforcement the ability to obtain information from cell phone providers that provided service to that device. Super fine distinction. Chee, I want to bring you in here first. This case deals with pings, the ability of telcos to figure out where a device is located based on how long it takes for a signal to get to up to 3 towers, or actually 3 or more different towers. Now, the ruling was specifically that law enforcement can't go to a cell provider to ask for that data without a warrant. But there are a lot of experts who are noting that this doesn't stop the use of other tracking methods. Why is there a fine line here?
You know, this is Cheebert squirming a little bit here. The whole idea is it or is it not public information when you can reach it without having to do a login? You can actually do triangulation using just straight IP addresses, especially when you start getting real addresses like IPv6, and you can find out what towers those are assigned to, so you can move around and find out what's going on. So on one hand, law enforcement does need a way to find out where the bad guys are moving around. And do they always have the time to go get a warrant? There probably needs to be a little bit of give and take here. Reality is we can't go and take away all the tools from law enforcement, but then again, we also have some Fourth Amendment rights to keep in mind. So I'm just going to say, let's be careful here and not set a really, really big precedent that is going to make it impossible for the law enforcement people to catch the bad guys.
Right. Well, Hubert, one of the things that really kind of strikes me is we covered a story not too long ago about the use of these stingrays, essentially GSM interceptors. the way that GSM works is a device will automatically attach to the strongest signal. So if you can broadcast at that frequency, pretending that you're one of the cell towers, it will connect to you, to your device, and then your device can retransmit to a cell tower. Essentially, you become a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, the weird thing is, even though this precedent says that law enforcement must get a warrant that specifically grants them the right to search through metadata contained on a telco's server, it does not stop them from sending up their own interceptors. That's one of these strange things I can't quite make sense of. They're saying that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy if a telco is storing your data, but no reasonable expectation of privacy in using a cell phone in a public area. Do you see where the line is drawn?
Yeah, I kind of do. I don't like how fuzzy that line is. You know, we actually saw people using stingrays over at DEF CON. And I kind of don't like that. But then again, at DEF CON, everybody knows that if you're turning on a cell phone, you'd better darn well make sure that cell phone doesn't have anything on it that you don't want to share. Now, I think the bottom line comes down to it, can this be interpreted as entrapment? I think that is the bottom line here. Because when you start using a stinger and create a man in the middle, are you falsely representing yourself as the cell tower? And can that be interpreted as entrapment? I don't like the fact that this is going into the highest court in the nation, because I think the highest court in the nation is sometimes being forced into making rulings based upon the current interpretation of the law. And I don't think the interpretation of laws are set up for this kind of technology. So again, I'm going to take the middle ground. It needs to have some balance here. We don't want to take the tools away, but we also want to make sure that we have at least a reasonable expectation of privacy.
Right. Curtis, I want to throw over to you this idea of reasonable expectation of privacy, because we are really walking on shaky ground here. If we say that data stored on a company server, a company that you paid to provide a service, is protected under the Fourth Amendment, but your license plate number as you drive across a bridge, or your smart tag transponder, or say your web searching activity is not protected, that actually does affect the enterprise quite a bit, because let's look at some of the biggest companies today, Apple, Google. They are using location data quite extensively in order to increase the quality of ads that get served to you. Why do you think it is that right now it feels as if we are demanding more accountability out of law enforcement in the use of location data than we are from a large corporation?
Well, I think there are several things at work here. To address your last point, I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people in this country, the reason that we trust the corporations more than law enforcement is exactly that. We tend to trust Google and Apple and the other large electronics firms more than we trust many branches of the law enforcement establishment. And that's a tragic and dangerous situation. For the rest of this, I think what we're seeing is in some ways an extension of what we were talking about last week when we were pointing out that from an accounting standpoint, data has no value. The only thing that matters is the physical server. In this case, we're getting back to the notion of who owns that data. In other words, when law enforcement tries to get what amounts to a wiretap on your phone, that means that they've asked the court for the ability to track the signal and to get information as it goes to and from. But the metadata, we've seen NSA and our national security infrastructure make the argument that the user doesn't own that data, that is data owned by the telco. And therefore, if the NSA wants to enlist the telco's help in getting access to that, it's none of the user's business. Now, the Florida Supreme Court has kind of agreed with that and said, great, you can get a court order to go and look at what's on the phone, the number that he called, but the metadata isn't his. And so to get information that belongs to someone else, the telco, you're going to have to get another specific court order or search warrant. We're going to be working through some of the details of things like this for some time. And as Brian said, this inevitably ends up at the Supreme Court's desk. And I'm not at all sure that they're really well prepared to deal with the intricacies of what data lives where, how it should be accessed, and who actually owns it.
All right. Actually, Crimson in the chat room makes a good point on why we hold LE to a higher standard. It's because Google can't put us in jail or on trial. And I get that, but I want to play big-time devil's advocate for both of you, because there is a popular sentiment going through out there right now, and the FBI is trying to drum it up and saying that their job is becoming too hard, saying, wait a minute, why do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy? If you don't know enough about your technology to make sure that you're not broadcasting your location when you don't want to, that you're not leaving electronic footprints when you don't want to, that you're not leaving fingerprints on the internet when you don't want to, then why do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy? They would compare it to somebody walking into the middle of a crowded park, screaming all of his darkest, deepest secrets at the top of his lungs, and then complaining when people in that park start talking about those darkest, deepest secrets. What's the difference here? I mean, if I don't understand what my devices are doing and that they are leaving bits of identifying information everywhere I go, why is that on LE and not on me? Cheebert, let me throw it to you first.
Oh, man. Tough one. Yeah. It starts coming down to what is the expectation of the sophistication of the user. If erasing your tracks, if turning off your location information is difficult to do and only really something expected of an expert in the field, is it really shouting in the middle of a crowded park? You know, it might be, you know, someone saying, well, hey, you know, I can, you know, if you're saying it over the company PA and it just happens to leak over, you know, boo-hoo-hoo. Bad analogy, but the problem is a lot of the users don't understand how to turn off this type of things. And I think that's one of the fine points. If it's too difficult to turn off, is it really a reasonable expectation? And I think that's one of the things the courts are going to have to take a good hard look at. And oh, by the way, now that Apple is saying they're going to encrypt a lot of different things, they're going to encrypt the entire phone, and the Department of Justice is getting all pissy, I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You know, now they're securing it, but yet, you know, wow, come on, get your story straight.
Right. Curtis, we've got Kemi Drag in the chat room who's taking the other side. He's saying, wait a minute, does that mean that only InfoSec and hackers are allowed to have tech because they're the only ones who know how to turn all this stuff off? But I would throw that back at you and say, what's bad about that? Why can't we expect people to take responsibility for what they're using? If I buy a car and I have no idea how that car works and I end up causing damage with that car, I'm still responsible for that even though I didn't understand how the car worked. Why should it be any different with an electronic device?
Well, yes and no. I think some of the lawsuits currently going through involving, say, General Motors might argue against that. And we do see a lot of interesting court cases still being developed and running through the system that involve the question of who owns the data in the black box attached to your airbags. So I'm not sure that that's a great analogy. I think that in many ways, pardon me, government has gone to great lengths to tell us just how secure cell phone communications are. Remember, it is illegal to intercept a cell phone conversation. I am an amateur radio operator, and it's very easy for me to get a radio receiver that can pick up cell phone signals. It is illegal for me to do so because our legislators have carved out a specific expectation of privacy for those communications. So I think what we are seeing is the beginning of an argument that ultimately boils down to consumers should have the absolute expectation of privacy except where government's concerned.
Wow.
And once the law enforcement people start making the, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, it shouldn't matter to you argument, then in this nation, they've lost the argument.
Well, gentlemen, I don't want to step away from this argument because it is fascinating, but I do want to evolve it a little bit with the second enterprise bite. We're talking about privacy. We're talking about reasonable expectation of privacy, especially in the age of the internet. Well, how about this? China may be running a man-in-the-middle attack against Apple iCloud. Greatfire.org, it's a group dedicated to the freedom of the press, has released technical documents that seem to indicate that China's Internet Security Bureau has been using fake Apple certificates to intercept and decrypt traffic going to and from the Apple iCloud. Now, the data gathered by Great Fire shows that forged certificates are being presented to users who are attempting to access Apple's websites in the United States. In all cases, users of the Chrome browser were informed of the forged certificates, but Firefox allowed the session to commence. Now, if this is a man-in-the-middle attack, that means that they could easily collect usernames and passwords, as well as anything that is uploaded or downloaded from the cloud. Now, Chee, let me throw this over to you first. Let's get cynical for a second. Do we really think that China is the only government that's doing this?
No, of course not. Man in the middle is just way too easy to do. But I will say, I have directly been attacked. You know, I've had the man in the middle attack done to one of my researchers that was lecturing in China, and he tried to do a VPN login back to Honolulu, and it basically they were harvesting his username and password, even though it was an encrypted certificate. The good news is the SSL VPN I was using actually compared the signature of the machine and said, no, that's not you, and put it into an endless loop, notified me, and then I went and started backtracking who it was. And gee, the IP address range that it was the man-in-the-middle attack was coming to was belonging to the Chinese government. So yes, I know they're doing it. It's not just Google, not just iCloud. They're going for all kinds of things. So I'm sorry, you know, China, bad, bad, bad. If you want to play in the world, start learning how to play nice.
Now, Curtis, I want to throw this over to you because I'm going to make something that's probably going to get people a little upset in a bit. But it used to be that we had to worry about bad actors, the occasional hacker, the black hat, the gray hat who was messing around with networks, playing with certificates, playing with trunks, doing man-in-the-middle attacks, maybe even getting an entire fiber link to themselves. But that was easy to explain away as the actions of a bad actor, and you could easily get rid of that in the next version of whatever XXYY. If we start talking about state actors, government-backed actors, government-backed agencies with unlimited budgets that have access to all of the infrastructure that drives the internet, then how can you ever assume that anything that goes into the cloud is not being peered at by at least one government?
If you are using consumer-level cloud services, you can't. And it's really that simple. So you can do a lot of things to try and make sure that you are as secure as possible. But most consumer-level cloud services are vulnerable, especially if you are using browsers that don't alert you when they see certificate issues. And if you are accustomed to just blithely clicking on the yes, go ahead, no matter what security exception is thrown. This is one of those cases, unlike the cell phone that we were just talking about, where consumers really do need to be vigilant and be somewhat educated. If you're going to use these services, know what they mean, know what's possible, and through all of that, make decisions on what you're willing to store in these cloud services. For most people, that's going to boil down to stuff that you really don't care if a whole bunch of folks see.
Chee, I want to expand on that because that's important. I'm at that point where I say, well, I just have to assume that anything I put into any cloud service, be it Dropbox or SkyDrive or Google Drive, whatever it might be, iCloud, someone is going to have access to it. I just can't count on secrecy anymore. Even if I encrypt something, I have to assume that someone has at least access to my data because there are too many bad actors and too many bad actors that are well-funded. Do we go past the don't put anything into the cloud that you're not okay with people seeing and now move into it's time to abandon the cloud? It was a great experiment. It was a nice idea that cut down cost for startups, but we are now at the point where we just can't afford it anymore. We can't afford continuous data breaches. We now have to go back to that private cloud concept, which is basically just what we had before, colos, data centers, data closets.
Actually, what we really need is we need cloud clients that auto encrypt. What should be done and should be going away are clients like Dropbox and so forth, where it will store unencrypted data. What we probably need to do is just encrypt everything. I think we also need to take a harder look at why some of these things happen. And that's because certs are really expensive, especially when you start having to protect an awful lot of machines. And in some cases, wildcard certs don't work. So that means your corporation is going to end up spending a lot of money. I would lay money down that some of these breaches are because someone got, to the end of their budget and they couldn't afford one more cert. And so they said, well, we'll just self-sign. I know I have to do that all the time because I'm short of money all the time because our National Science Foundation, a lot of other granting agencies aren't giving us as much money as they used to. So we've had to cut corners. Now, for cloud, directly answer your question, yeah, we need to have better cloud clients. I don't think clouds are dead. I think clouds are wonderful. I think they do a lot of good for the world, but I think we need to start getting into clients that auto-encrypt what we store there.
Well, gentlemen, I do want to move away from this because I think we're falling down the rat's nest here. We will come back to it because we're going to have to talk a lot about cloud and cloud security if we're talking about the enterprise. Let's do one last enterprise bite before we move on to welcome our guest, and that's one of the quick bits here. Google's rollout of their new wireless broadband, I think, actually warrants a deeper discussion. So here are the things we know. We know that they've applied to the FCC for permits to operate in Mountain View and here in the Bay Area. We know that they're going to be using 3 different radio systems within each of these devices, a 5.8 gigahertz 802.11 AGNAC radio, a 24.2 gigahertz mesh wireless radio, and a 71 to 76 gigahertz millimeter wave radio. Now, it's this combination of radio, text, and spectrum that I find fascinating because with the 5.4 gigahertz radio, you can get above the 2.4 gigahertz trash. You can distribute to individual clients and individual houses. With the 24.2 gigahertz radio, you get about 13 kilometers of range, so you can do mesh between the major points. And with the 71 to 76 gigahertz millimeter wave radio, you can get up to 25 kilometers of range with up to, I think it was 10 gigabits per second is the maximum that you can do point to point. It sounds to me as if they're trying to figure out a cheaper way to rule out Google Fiber. Cheebert, does this make sense to you? I mean, one of the biggest expenses of Google Fiber is not necessarily running the trunk lines, it's getting it to each house and getting the right of way. If Google could strategically deploy to certain points within a city, set up these Uber hotspots and do point-to-point mesh down into individual neighborhoods, it significantly decreases the amount of capital overlay they have to spend in order to roll out fiber to a city.
Oh, you bet. Yeah, the number one cost of, let's just call a spade a spade, the number one cost of cell towers is the backhaul to link them together. Not only that, it also is the cost of keeping all the cell towers synchronized. That's some fairly expensive equipment. Right now, they're using a lot of 802. IEEE 1588 precision time to keep all the towers synchronized. Now, if you have control over the wireless links, synchronizing towers become a lot easier. and lots of neat things start happening, and the cost goes down, so you can afford to have greater penetration. Now, what this is going to really make a difference on is when you start getting into what is normally called lifeline services. Right now, say for instance, if you are a farm in Iowa and you're out in the middle of nowhere, if you want to have a telco into your farm, you actually have to pay for those telephone poles to get them to your farm. You know, it might be a couple miles away. Starts getting very expensive. With wireless, that means a single tower out in the middle of nowhere can cover an awful lot of people and make it cheaper to provide. So I think Google's got a winning combination, especially in those frequency ranges, because there are a lot more channels to play with, a lot less chance for interference, and oh my God, it's a great technology to start with.
Yeah, yeah. Curtis, especially if they use the new beam-forming micro antennas, which I remember seeing a demonstration, which I'm probably not allowed to talk about, but if I don't mention the company, this will be fine. I saw an array that used these beam-forming antennas all around the edges of the array, and this array could do 76 gigahertz wireless beams, pencil-thin beams, about 400 of them from a single array out to individual arrays, and you could get distance and speed. We're talking about 10 gigabits per second of speed per pencil-thin beam. And then you pair that up with the 24.2 gigahertz wireless, which I believe Ubiquiti is already playing with, and they've got a technology that can deliver 1.4 gigabits per second, again, about that 13 kilometers away. Suddenly you have something that it's wireless, but it's not wireless like we've ever used it before. Is this going to make a difference? I mean, if Google can reduce the cost of a rollout from, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars to tens of millions of dollars, suddenly the telcos really have to start sweating.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, as Brian said, you know, the expensive part of a broadband rollout is the copper. That's the thing. The only thing that I see to worry about in all this is up there at the 71 to 76 gig range, because you start getting into some frequencies where environmentals can matter. I know once you get up into the millimeter range, especially as you climb north of about 70 gigahertz, things like a heavy fog can provide just a ton of attenuation. So I think this is one where in some locations, you know, Phoenix, Tucson, this would be ideal, and you could probably run great long distances. Florida, maybe not. But one way or the other, it's very exciting that they're exploring all of these different areas, especially since in our band allocation plan, the stuff up really high in the spectrum, there are lots of openings for this kind of commercial stuff. We haven't seen a lot of demand for this among commercial users before. So I'm very excited about this, and I'm going to be interested to see precisely how they go about solving some of those technical challenges.
Right, right. When we come back, we're going to be speaking with Howard Marks from DeepStorage.net. He's been running a lab and an experiment to see what are the best practices for enterprise-class storage. We're going to sit down with him and figure out what he's learned over the past few years. But before that, let's go ahead and take a break and talk about the second sponsor of the Twilight Riot. You know him. You love him. It's TEKSERVE. Now, we are seeing some amazing technology solutions being deployed on iPads these days. Businesses keep coming up with better ways to service their customers, to increase productivity, all without spending more. In other words, they're looking for a force multiplier, and the force multiplier is that iPad. And if you're looking at an iPad, you should be looking at TEKSERVE. For example, the Institute of Culinary Education equips students, faculty, and chefs with the iPad, empowering them to do away with heavy and unwieldy textbooks and streamline the learning process. A major cable service provider in the Northeast gave its field technicians, who are the public face of the company, iPads that had been configured to provide better service to customers. And retail companies have enhanced their in-store customer experience by using the iPad, not just as a point-of-sale device, but also as a spot where customers can come to learn about sales, special offers, and upcoming events. These clients and more have turned to TEKSERVE, the country's largest Apple reseller that sells, supports, and manages the largest iPad deployments in the world to manage their iPad projects. If you're considering adding iPads to your business, well, why not ensure your project's success with an experienced partner? TEKSERVE assists businesses of all sizes to deploy Apple solutions, as well as solutions from Avid, Adobe, and more throughout the United States. No matter if you've started deploying iPads or are just getting started, TEKSERVE can help. And right now, TEKSERVE is offering a complimentary download just for Twiat listeners who are deploying iPads or who are interested in learning more about doing so. Go to tekserve.com/Twiat-7sins to get access to the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment and see the common pitfalls that throw companies for a loop during their iPad projects. This complimentary download is available right now just for Twiat listeners at tekserve.com/Twiat-7sins. And we thank TEKSERVE for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. We welcome to the show Mr. Howard Marks from DeepStorage.net. Mr. Marks, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Padre.
Now, Howard, could you tell us, who are you and why did you start DeepStorage.net?
Well, I started, it was DeepStorage.net. We've kind of changed it to Deep Storage LLC, but basically I started when the publishing industry blew up in the last century. I have been doing product reviews for publications, starting at PC Magazine in 1492. But the magazines no longer had money to run labs, and the vendors still needed somebody to independently validate that their products worked. And so I took the lab that I had, that I designed to do product reviews for magazines, and turned to the dark side and started taking money from vendors to take their gear and bring it into the lab and beat it into submission and show what it can do.
All right. And what have you found mostly? I mean, this is something that Chee does on a regular basis. That's the whole point of his lab. Get equipment in, beat it until it dies, and then report on what it can and cannot do. When you're talking about storage, what kind of claims, what are the most outlandish claims that you've seen?
Well, back when deduplication was first coming into the backup market, you would see claims of, up to 100-to-1 data reduction. And of course, data deduplication, the technology is very data dependent. And if you send it 400 gigabytes of pure zeros, you'll get better than 100-to-1 data reduction. But up to are the weaseliest of weasel words. Anytime somebody says you can get up to, what they're really saying is you won't get this, but I'm going to use this number anyway.
Right, right. Of course, I don't want to point out any specific manufacturers unless you want to, because I would prefer that they go to your website and figure out exactly what you're reporting on. But when you start thinking about these claims and these up to claims, what are the ones that you think people should be most suspicious about? I mean, I think we've all been trained to know that the specs you're going to get are in a perfect world under ideal conditions, and you're probably never going to see them in the real world. But what are the ones that ring alarm bells for you? When you see it, you go, okay, that's the thing.
The one that annoys me at the moment is all of the vendors that make hybrid storage systems that have some flash and some spinning disk, and the intelligence to theoretically place your data in the most appropriate medium. So the data that's being accessed frequently, the hot data goes in flash, and the data that's not being accessed frequently, the cold data goes on disk where it's cheaper. A lot of those vendors are publishing, or even worse, telling the people at the few publications left that do product reviews that you should do your benchmarks against a data set that's very small. And the advantage of that, of course, is, first of all, your benchmarks run really fast, so you don't have to spend as much time in the lab. But it also means that all that data fits in the flash component of their system. And so you're measuring how fast the system would be if it didn't have the spinning disks in the first place. In the real world, if you're going to buy a system that's got 10 gigabytes of flash and 100 gigabytes of spinning disk, or more likely, turn those into terabyte numbers, you're going to have more data than fits in the flash. And what I really want to know about that system is what happens when there's a cache miss. How well does it segregate that data and put the hot data where the hot data goes and the cold data where the cold data goes? And testing with a small data set doesn't do that. And one vendor published that their system did 2 million 100% read 4K IOPS from 32 gigabytes of the 2 terabytes of total capacity. It's just meaningless drivel.
So I take it you're not a huge fan of SSHD technology.
Well, there's three places for SSHDs. In my laptop, I've got a Western Digital Black. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable place to use some solid state and some disk, because I want to load up a bunch of movies for the 3-week trip to Europe I'm going to take, and those things don't deserve the hundreds of dollars extra I'd have to pay for a bigger SSD. When we start talking about inside an enterprise storage system, I think it would be better for the controller to be smarter and for the controller to decide what data goes in the flash and what data goes on the spinning disk than to take the whatever amount of flash we're talking about and slice it up and put a little bit in each spinning disk. Now, if you've got an old system that doesn't really know how to do that, we've got the Band-Aid solution for hybrid drives. But in the enterprise, I think smarter controllers that know about flash will be more effective than hybrid hard drives.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about flash, because we've had a couple of guests come here onto This Week in Enterprise Tech, and actually onto a few of my other shows here on the Twit TV network, talking about how it's just a matter of time before we switch to flash for all of our performance needs. I mean, especially in the enterprise, when you're talking about a lot of IOPS, really high transaction rates, it doesn't make sense to think about a hybrid storage system if you've got the budget. What's your experience with that? Have you been able to play with a lot of flash arrays?
I've played with a couple of all-flash arrays. I currently have one in the lab that vendors left us here for long-term use, and I've got a very nice hybrid that also is here on a long-term loan. Is there a place for hybrids? I think breaks down the thing there's two things you have to think about. The first is that it's not just the number of IOPS that enterprise needs, but it's also that enterprise has sufficient talent to segregate their data, to say, this is the data that needs 100,000 IOPS, and this is my archive data that needs to be on disk because I do need, several second access time to it, but that either the access is going to be primarily sequential or it's going to be so infrequent that disk performance is okay. If you're a smaller organization, that segregation becomes a lot harder. Just look at, you're a mid-sized company and you've been running SAP or Microsoft Dynamics for 5 or 6 years. So that Oracle or SQL Server database that holds your ERP data has not just the active inventory and sales orders, but it's got every sales order for the past 10 years stored in it. And you would need to have a really clever DBA to be able to take the old stale data that you're not going to throw away because the accounting guys once a year use it for reports, but separate it into different databases that would be transparent to the application.
Got it.
If I throw that at a hybrid system, the hybrid system will do that for me. So it's not just that if you're big enough to need an all-flash array, you should buy one, but if you have the knowledge to be able to, because you're not going to get rid of the disk. You still have old stale data. Everybody has old stale data. So it's do you have the time, talent, and expertise to tease your data apart? And I think in the mid-market, people don't. And that still doesn't mean that we're not talking about a system that doesn't, we can still have a system that delivers 150,000 IOPS and stores 300 terabytes of data. It's still got as much flash as a 32 terabyte all flash array. It's just also got the disks.
Right. I want to bring in some of my co-hosts here just to get in on this discussion, because it is fascinating. Cheebert, you first, because of course you are our man with the technical background who has actually played with the gear. I think storage is one of those forgotten pieces of IT. As strange as it sounds, we've known for the longest time that our server technology is changing, our switch technology is changing. We've even acknowledged that our cooling and power needs are changing. But storage is one of these things where we just figure more and faster, more and faster. And every time we go through an upgrade cycle, it's just more and faster. Whereas, as we're hearing from Mr. Marks, it needs to be more nuanced now. You actually have to look at what you're going to be doing with that storage to determine what is the best price performance you're going to get.
Oh, I totally agree with him. Even in the academic world, which is kind of weird to begin with, it's now starting to get down to what is online, what is nearline, what is archive. Because everybody's generating way too much data to keep it all online. So I'm actually quite fond. You know, some of the guys in the chat room are talking about, oh, I love the good old days of tape. Well, tape is bad in high humidity, so we're going with Blu-rays, you know, archival, which is sometimes the seek time on that can be measured in minutes. But what it's forcing us to do is the cost of keeping this data available is we have to start making compromises and start categorizing our data. And I think that's going to be the key. It's not just spin up more spindles, it's be more reasonable about what is stored where and how fast.
Where and how fast? Curtis, let me ask you about that. Have you covered storage much over at Information Week and Information Week Radio? I mean, it is a very important topic, but it seems a lot of people get bored whenever you start talking about storage arrays.
Well, a lot of people, you know, their eyes do glaze over once you start talking about storage. Now, we have had Howard for some of our shows, stretching back to the enterprise efficiency days, because he is that rare sort of person who can make storage seem not only understandable, but at least vaguely interesting. But I think that where a lot of people are starting to become confused now is the whole notion, and this is being suggested by a lot of vendors, that SSD is going to solve all of the storage issues. That solid state storage is now becoming so inexpensive that for any even moderately complex or valuable data storage, that it's the way to go. I would love to, we've heard Howard talk about that somewhat, and I know that he doesn't believe that that is yet the case, but he's also quite correct. You know, I can remember back when I ran a lab almost 20 years ago now. The DBAs, the database administrators, spent a lot of time doing things like figuring out how to lay down data track by track, sector by sector, in order to get the best performance. Those concerns have changed now. DBAs are looking at a different level, but they're no less important. And once again, I think that there are many, especially mid-level enterprise IT bosses, who have somehow been convinced that storage has become so fast that we don't have to pay attention to how the data is laid out. And I'm not sure that's quite true. You know, I'd love to hear Howard talk a little bit about the importance of laying out data, and especially when you've got different devices in a total system. We hear a lot of people talking about now the importance of things like rack-top networking. How is that playing into storage architecture? You know, are we getting beyond just the device when it comes to caring about how all these systems are put together?
Actually, that is a great question for Mr. Marks. Howard, what about that? You know, when we start talking about racktop, when we start talking about not looking at storage as just a big dumb pile of stuff, but part of the new generation of software-defined networks, where are we heading?
We're heading in several almost mutually exclusive directions. You know, 10 years ago, the steely-eyed storage guy's job was figuring out how many spindles and how to short stroke to get you the IOPS that you needed. And there was a lot of manual tuning of dials. And between flash and faster processors, storage systems have just gotten smart enough that that work isn't necessary. Now, when we talk about layout, we have to remember that flash is weird stuff. And so the optimizations of layout are very different for flash and spinning disks. in a spinning disk system, the cardinal sin is moving the heads. And the controller and the software and everything else in the system was designed to prevent the heads from having to be moved. In a flash environment, random I/O, the logical equivalent of moving the heads, is fine. Flash does random I/O just as fast as it does sequential. The cardinal sin is write amplification. The cardinal sin is writing any more data than you have to, because Flash has limited endurance. And so the physical data layout is very different. And that's why, startup vendors who design their systems with Flash in mind can get the same performance from less Flash than the Dells and EMCs and NetApps of the world that added Flash to existing designs with existing data layouts and had to make compromises between performance and how much they wore out the Flash and what kind of Flash they had to use. In terms of rack scale architectures, what we're seeing is a small scale, the server SAN, where instead of having an external storage array that's shared by the servers in a hypervisor cluster, there's a VM or a process in the kernel in each host that takes the local drives and pools it with the local drives of all of the other hosts to create a virtual storage array. And of course, those drives are partially Flash and partially spinning disk. And a couple of vendors have come out with all Flash versions that I think is a mistake, but we can leave that part aside. The other thing we're seeing is rack scale architectures where we have many, many microservers or servers with, or x86 servers with local Flash that's used as cache, and then rack scale back-end storage. If you look at the pictures of a typical rack in a Facebook data center, there's frequently a couple of storage servers at the bottom to hold the data for the compute that's going on above it.
Right. Actually, I want to give you a question from the chat room. We've got Max1234, who I think is piggybacking on what you're saying about optimizing for the different types of media that you have in your storage network. What would you expect to see coming out of smart controllers in the near future? I mean, they are going to have to optimize for all flash, hybrid, and all rotating drive arrays. Is that something that's going to become a selling point as manufacturers move on to their next generation of storage projects?
I think that, we're going to see both continuing optimization in the hybrid side and a bifurcation of storage in the enterprise where there's all flash and, probably object storage for most of the longer term capabilities. The big things coming down the pike in terms of storage, and these are really big by comparison to, the changes a few years ago where a new model would get announced and I'd say it's bigger and faster, and they would go, yep, and we'd hang up the phone and the call'd be over. The first is the introduction of micro volumes, VMware's vVols, that allows storage arrays to provide replication and snapshots and the other services that the storage hardware provides on a per VM basis instead of a per logical disk basis. Hand in hand with that is storage quality of service, where we can say assign individual VMs quotas and the like for the number of IOPS or the amount of data that they can transfer, so that we can minimize the impact of noisy neighbors. One of the things people are starting to have trouble with is they're implementing private cloud solutions, which means IT has no real idea what those applications that people are spinning up VM instances for are. And every once in a while, one of them is the storage equivalent of my teenage self playing The Who with the volume turned up to 11 and sucks up all of the available storage performance for all the other VMs in the infrastructure. So storage QoS is going to be giving us the capability to control that.
One last question, and before we have to call it quits, and actually we're already going over time here. When you look at how storage is being deployed in the enterprise today, what would you say is the cardinal sin, the biggest mistake that you see over and over as they either plan, deploy, or maintain their storage plants?
There are two. There's the classic the fact we've always done this before is a reason to keep doing it. And so, storage guys are paranoid. And storage guys are paranoid for good reason, because when we make mistakes, they stick around a lot longer than when server and network guys make mistakes. But that has led to a lot of excess conservatism in the storage world, where people want to buy whatever it is they bought the last time. The other problem I'm seeing is Flash as a sledgehammer, where people look at an application, they say, this application has a storage problem because my storage system can only give it 3,000 or 4,000 IOPS. So I'm going to put a $10,000 PCIe SSD in that server and go from 3,000 IOPS to 150,000 IOPS. And as we all know, you don't kill bottlenecks, you just move them. And so by throwing way too much storage performance at that application, they're now don't have any cache to deal with what the next bottleneck that appears, because now storage isn't the bottleneck anymore.
Fantastic. Mr. Marks, I want to thank you so very much for giving us your time.
My pleasure. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
I was just about to tell you, we will most definitely do this again. In fact, I've been thinking of an idea for an episode. I want to do a storage brawl for it all, getting some of the brightest people we've got, Alan Malventano, my friends over at Kingston, just get us together and talk about the future of enterprise storage. Would you be up for that?
Oh, certainly.
And could you please tell the folks at home where they can find you, where they can find your work, where they can find a contact information for you in case they want to write you and ask questions about what you do at Deep Storage?
Sure. I write a column at networkcomputing.com. I'm the co-host with my friend Ray Lucchese of the Graybeards on Storage podcast, where the two of us, both old enough to remember having worked on mainframes, talk to upstarts in the storage business. And on the Twitters, you can find me at DeepStorageNet. And of course, there's DeepStorage.net, our corporate website.
Mr. Howard Marks from DeepStorage.net, Deep Storage LLC. We thank you very much for giving your time to This Week in Enterprise Tech.
My pleasure.
Of course, I also want to thank my two co-hosts, starting with Mr. Brian Chee. Cheebert, what are you up to other than staying dry? Where does a Twilight Right need to go to find your latest and greatest?
Actually, right now, I am just going crazy trying to get ready to sail. Because of the hurricane, our sail date is no longer the 28th. It looks like it's going to be the 30th. And we're going to go out and fix the lights for the Aloha Cabled Observatory. And if all goes well, you're going to be able to peer into the depth of 3 miles down and be able to see the weird beasties that live down there.
Yeah, it's actually a very cool project. In case any of you don't know what it is, make sure to join Cheebert at Twitter at ADVNetLab, Advanced Network Laboratory, and look for the link, because some of the footage from that observatory it's kind of breathtaking. Going over to you, Curtis Franklin, what is the latest and greatest over at Information Week Radio?
Well, we're going to be doing a lot of interesting stuff, getting ready for the next Interop. We're just coming off of Interop New York, so there'll be some follow-up stuff happening there. We're going to be getting ready for Interop Las Vegas. We're also going to, I think, be doing some great shows, getting ready for the Enterprise Connect show. Radio is becoming a bigger and bigger part of what's happening at Information Week, dark reading, and network computing, and we would love to have lots of listeners come over and join us.
Cheebert, Curtis, thank you again. It's not Twilight without you. Also, we want to thank you, our loyal audience, the listener, the watcher who downloads each and every single episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. We want to give you something, a way to get every episode into your device of choice automatically. All you have to do is drop by our show page at twit.tv/Twyat. There you'll find a little drop-down menu that will give you all the different versions of our show that you can download automatically each week into your iPad, your iPhone, your Android tablet or phone, your Mac, your PC, your laptop, your desktop. No matter what it is and no matter what format you want, we've got it for you because, well, we love you. Also, did you know that you can follow me on the Twitters? Just go to twitter.com/PadresJ. That's at PadresJ. If you follow me, you'll find out what I'm doing each and every single week on all the shows I do here on the Twit TV network. That includes Twiet on Mondays at 2:30, Padres Corner at 7:30 on Tuesday nights, and on Thursday you see me twice. Once at 11 o'clock a.m. for Know How, where I do some geeky projects with my co-host Cranky Hippo, and at 1:30 for Coding 101, where I'll teach you all the latest and greatest about living like a code monkey. You know, we also do this show live. That's right, here, live on Monday, 2:30 p.m. If you join us at live.twit.tv, you get to see the pre-show, the post-show, and everything in between. That means if we cut anything out because of bloopers, well, you'll get to see it. If we do fun stuff before and after the show with our guest, you'll get to see us. And as long as you're watching us live, why not jump into our chat room at irc.twit.tv? You'll notice that I pull questions a lot out of the chat room. It's because it's filled with some of the brightest folks, some of the coolest engineers, and yeah, some of the funniest members of the Twit TV army. I also want to thank everyone here at the Brick House who makes this show possible, to Lisa and Leo for letting me do this, for Karsten, my super producer, and of course, my absolutely fabulous technical director, Mr. Jason Howell. Mr. Howell, I understand that you have a show here on the Twit TV network in which you talk about, is it Windows Phone?
No, keep going.
iOS?
No, one more.
BlackBerry.
Yes, BlackBerry.
It's all about BlackBerry.
Yes.
No, of course, all about Android, folks.
That's right, all about Android. Twit.tv/AAA, live every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Tomorrow's episode is going to be big, folks. I mean, we kind of had like the big unload of all the madness of Android and Nexus and Lollipop and all that just a few days ago. So tomorrow's show is going to be big. You should check it out. And then this Friday is Android App Arena at twit.tv/arena.
There you go.
Reviewing apps.
Go do it. Boom. Yep. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Ballecer, just reminding you that if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, just keep quiet.